When you click on a gaming laptop that boasts a 17-inch screen, an RTX 4050 and a Core i7, the first thing that pops into your head is, wow, that's going to run everything smoothly. But the disappointment sets in when you actually power it up, plug in your favorite headset, and realize the heat curls up the edges, the battery drains faster than you expected, or the keyboard feels like a cheap typewriter rather than a weapon-ready control panel. I've been in that exact spot before buying a machine that looks amazing on the product page and then finding out it doesn't match the hype in everyday play. That's why this review matters. I'm going to walk through the real-world experience of the Thunderobot Storm 17 so you can decide if it's the right fit for your gaming setup before you spend a chunk of cash. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First impressions matter, and the Storm 17 does a good job of catching your eye. The 17.3-inch FHD panel runs at 144 Hz, which, on paper, promises buttery smooth motion for fast shooters and fluid frame rates for open-world adventures. In practice, I tested it with Valorant and Elden Ring side by side with a 1080p 144 Hz monitor I already own. The colors were slightly more saturated, giving that extra punch you look for in a gaming laptop, and the high refresh rate indeed eliminated the dreaded ghosting when I spun around in combat. However, the panel's brightness topped out around 300 nits, which isn't a problem in a dim room but becomes noticeable if you game near a window or in a bright office. The glossy finish does make reflections a bit of a nuisance, so if you plan to game in a well-lit environment you'll probably want an anti-glare screen protector. The internals are where the Storm 17 starts to show its personality. The Core i7-13620H is a 12-core, 16-thread chip that handles modern titles without breaking a sweat. Pair that with 16GB of DDR5 RAM and a 512GB NVMe SSD, and you have a machine that loads games in under a minute and keeps the frame rate steady. I installed Cyberpunk 2077 with ray tracing on medium settings. The laptop maintained a solid 55 frames per second average, which is respectable for a mid-range GPU like the RTX 4050. The SSD space, though, feels a little tight once you start stacking a few AAA titles and a library of mods. You'll probably need an external drive or upgrade to a larger internal SSD down the line if you're a collector. One of the hidden trade-offs shows up in the cooling system. Thunderobot markets the wind-driven thermal mastery as a way to keep the laptop cool, and it does work, but not in the way you might expect. The fans spin up aggressively under load, and you'll hear a noticeable whirring that can be distracting during quiet narrative moments. The laptop runs about 75 degrees under sustained gaming, which is safe for the components, but it means the device gets warm to the touch on the palm side. If you tend to game with your hands resting on the keyboard for long stretches, you might feel the heat creeping up. The upside is that the cooling keeps the GPU from throttling, so you don't lose performance over a long session. Battery life is another practical concern that gets overlooked in most spec sheets. With a 90 Wh battery, the Storm 17 still only manages roughly 34 hours of mixed-use gaming, streaming, and browsing. That's fine if you primarily game plugged in, but it isn't a travel companion you can rely on for a full day of play on a plane. You'll quickly learn to keep the charger handy, and the lag-free connectivity of the included Wi-Fi 6E and the HDMI 2.1 port are solid for a stationary setup. The HDMI output supports 4K at 60 Hz, so you can easily dock the laptop to a larger display for a more immersive experience, which is something many 17-inch gamers appreciate. Who should consider the Storm 17? If you're a mid-range gamer who wants a larger screen without stepping up to a desktop, and you don't mind plugging in most of the time, this laptop hits a sweet spot. It's especially appealing for someone who plays a mix of competitive shooters and story-driven RPGs, because the 144 Hz panel shines in fast-paced titles while still offering enough color depth for cinematic moments. The RGB Backlit Keyboard, while not the most tactile, adds a nice visual cue and is useful for low-light gaming sessions. If you already own an external monitor and need a portable powerhouse that can also double as a workstation for video editing or 3D modeling, the 16GB RAM and RTX 4050 can handle those workloads without a hiccup. On the flip side, skip this laptop if you're a hardcore sport competitor who needs an ultra-responsive, low-latency setup with a matte screen and a quieter cooling system. The fan noise might be a deal-breaker during tournament streams, and the lack of a higher refresh, higher brightness panel could put you at a subtle disadvantage. Also, if you plan to run the most demanding ray-traced games at ultra settings, the RTX 4050 will eventually show its limits, and you'll notice.